Mark Bennett returns home from deployment, eager to reunite with his wife, Emily, and their daughter, Sophie, only to discover a devastating betrayal. Emily has been having an affair with his best friend, Ryan. As Mark fights to protect his family and secure custody of his daughter, he faces manipulation, lies, and escalating schemes from Emily and Ryan. The story unravels a web of deceit, betrayal, and legal battles, leaving viewers outraged by the depths of infidelity and betrayal faced by a man who risked everything for his family. Welcome back, and thanks for tuning in. Before we dive into today's story, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? We always love hearing from you. Now, let's jump right into it. The air felt heavy, even for June. Thick, humid heat clung to Mark Bennett's skin as he stepped off the plane at Houston International Airport. After 12 grueling months overseas, the sounds of everyday life, the hum of traffic, the chatter of families reuniting, felt almost surreal. He adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, scanning the crowd for his wife, Emily, and their daughter, Sophie. Nothing. Mark checked his phone. No missed calls, no texts, just the same empty inbox he'd stared at for the last 3 weeks. He brushed it off. Maybe Emily got caught in traffic. Houston wasn't exactly known for smooth commutes. Still, the uneasy knot in his stomach tightened. Emily wasn't the type to be late. If anything, she was annoyingly punctual, the kind of person who arrived 20 minutes early to doctor's appointments and panicked if she forgot to set the dinner table before guests arrived. It was one of the quirks Mark had fallen in love with. But now, he pulled out his phone again, opening their last text exchange. It had been brief, almost distant. She'd told him she couldn't wait for him to come home, but something about her words had felt rehearsed, like someone saying what they thought they were supposed to say, not what they felt. Mark shook it off. Deployments made people act strange. He'd read about it. Stress, loneliness, miscommunication, all normal. The cab ride home felt longer than the flight. The streets looked familiar, yet different. New restaurants, different billboards, subtle signs of time passing without him. Mark leaned his head against the window, his thoughts drifting to Sophie. She turned 5 while he was gone. He'd missed her birthday, her first day of kindergarten, and her recital. Emily had sent videos, but it wasn't the same. He promised himself he'd make up for it. When the cab finally pulled into their driveway, Mark's first instinct was to smile. The house looked perfect. Freshly cut grass, flower beds neatly trimmed, and the porch light glowing softly. But something was off. The curtains in the living room were different, blue instead of white. And the wreath Emily always hung on the door. Gone. Mark's pulse quickened as he climbed out of the car. He was overthinking it. That's what deployment did. It made you suspicious of everything. He unlocked the door, stepping into a space that felt foreign, despite being his own. The living room smelled different. No trace of Emily's lavender candles. Instead, the faint scent of unfamiliar cologne hung in the air. Emily? Silence. Sophie? Footsteps echoed down the stairs, fast and light. Sophie barreled into view, her eyes lighting up as she spotted him. Daddy! Mark dropped his duffel bag, catching her mid-leap. He buried his face in her hair, breathing her in. She still smelled like strawberry shampoo and crayons. Hey, Peanut, I missed you so much. Sophie pulled back, her little face scrunched in confusion. Why didn't you tell Mommy you were coming home? Mark blinked. What do you mean I emailed her a week ago? She didn't tell me. Before Mark could ask more, Sophie's eyes darted nervously toward the stairs. She's upstairs, Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. With Uncle Ryan. Mark froze. Ryan? The same Ryan who had been his best man. The same Ryan who had promised to check in on Emily and Sophie while he was deployed. Mark gently set Sophie down. Stay here, he said softly. Each step up the staircase felt heavier than the last. Halfway up, he paused, listening. A muffled voice, Ryan's, followed by soft laughter. Mark's vision blurred. He pushed the bedroom door open. Emily gasped, scrambling to pull the covers over herself as Ryan shot up, half-dressed and wide-eyed. Mark! Emily's voice cracked. Ryan froze like a deer in headlights. The world tilted. Mark's fists clenched, his instincts screaming at him to react, but he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he stepped back, his voice steady, despite the storm inside him. Get out. Ryan hesitated, but Mark's tone left no room for argument. He grabbed his shirt and bolted. Emily pulled the sheets tighter, tears streaming down her face. Mark, it's not what it looks like. Don't. His voice cut through the air like a blade. He turned and walked out, each step slower than the last, as Sophie peeked up at him from the bottom of the stairs. Where's Uncle Ryan going? Mark knelt, forcing himself to keep his voice calm. He's leaving, Peanut for good. Her lip quivered, but she didn't cry. Mark wished he could say the same. Later that night, after Emily left to give him space, Mark sat on the couch, staring at his wedding photo. The smiles felt fake, now staged. He replayed the scene in his head over and over, dissecting every detail: the bed, the smell of cologne, the way Emily had flinched when she saw him. The pieces started falling into place. Ryan's sudden interest in helping Emily adjust while he was gone, the distance in her voice during their last calls. Mark's chest tightened. He'd spent the past year dodging bullets, worrying about making it home in one piece. And this was what waited for him? But Mark wasn't broken. Not yet. He'd fought wars before, and he wasn't about to lose this one. Mark's eyes burned as he stared at the dim glow of his phone screen. It was almost midnight, but sleep felt impossible. Emily had texted 3 times already, short, frantic messages begging him to talk. He hadn't answered. Instead, he scrolled through old photos of their life together. Vacations, birthday parties, quiet mornings with Sophie curled up in their bed. Each image felt like a punch to the gut. How long had it been going on? Weeks, months. Maybe even before he deployed. Mark's knuckles turned white as he gripped the phone. He should have seen it. The subtle changes, Emily's shorter calls, Ryan's sudden eagerness to help out while Mark was away. And now, those pieces fit together like shards of broken glass, cutting deeper the more he thought about it. But anger wouldn't fix this. Mark had learned in the military that emotion was a liability. It clouded judgment and led to mistakes. He needed a plan. The next morning, Mark woke to Sophie's soft footsteps padding across the hardwood floor. Daddy? He sat up, forcing a smile. Hey, Peanut, what's up? She climbed onto the bed, clutching the stuffed rabbit he'd sent her from overseas. Are you mad at Mommy? Mark's chest tightened. No, sweetheart, he said, brushing her hair back. I'm just tired. Sophie's brow furrowed, but she didn't push. Instead, she hugged her rabbit tighter. Can we still go to the park today? Mark hesitated. Part of him wanted to curl up and drown in the betrayal, but Sophie needed him. Of course we can. Her face lit up, and for a moment, Mark felt something other than rage. The park was crowded, kids screaming, dogs barking, and parents chasing after toddlers. Mark sat on the bench, pretending to watch Sophie while his thoughts drifted. Ryan. The man had been like a brother to him. They'd served together, celebrated birthdays, and spent holidays side by side. And now? Mark pulled out his phone and typed Ryan's name into social media. His profile popped up, filled with pictures of expensive dinners, golf outings, and what looked like a recent trip to Cancun. Mark clicked through the comments. Emily had liked almost every post. His jaw tightened. As he kept scrolling, a message popped up. Emily. We need to talk, please. Mark's thumb hovered over the screen before he shut it off. Talk? What could she possibly say to make this better? Later that night, Mark paced the kitchen while Sophie slept upstairs. His phone buzzed again. Emily, I'm coming over. We need to figure this out. Figure it out? Mark had nothing left to figure out. But when the knock came 10 minutes later, he opened the door anyway. Emily stood there, eyes red and puffy. Mark, he held up a hand. Don't. Please let me explain. Mark leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. Explain what? That you slept with my best friend? Or that you lied to me and let him play dad while I was risking my life overseas? Emily flinched, but Mark didn't stop. I trusted you, I trusted him, and you both threw it away. Tears streamed down her face, but Mark didn't feel sorry. I didn't plan for this to happen, she choked out. Mark laughed bitterly. That's the problem, Emily. You didn't plan anything. You just let it happen. She looked down, and for the first time Mark saw something in her eyes. Shame. I was lonely, she whispered. You were gone, and Ryan was there. He said all the right things, and I… Stop. Mark's voice was sharp. He stepped back, leaving just enough space for her to know she wasn't welcome. I'm not doing this tonight, go home. Emily opened her mouth to argue, but Mark shut the door. The lock clicked, and for the first time since he'd stepped off the plane, Mark felt like he was taking control. The next morning, Mark woke up determined. He wasn't going to be another soldier left broken by betrayal. First, he called a lawyer. Then, he dug through their financial records. If Emily thought she could walk away from this without consequences, she was wrong. As Mark sifted through bank statements, his phone buzzed. A text from Ryan. Mark, I'm sorry, I didn't mean for this to happen. Can we talk? Mark stared at the message, his blood boiling. Talk. The man hadn't just betrayed him. He'd invaded his home, his family. Mark's fingers flew over the screen. You're dead to me. Stay away from my daughter. He hit send and blocked the number. Over the next few days, Mark focused on Sophie. He took her to the park, helped with her homework, and tucked her into bed each night with the same bedtime story she'd loved since she was 3. But when Sophie was asleep, Mark went back to work. He started gathering evidence, texts, emails, financial records. He wasn't just going to divorce Emily, he was going to make sure the courts saw the truth. Ryan, on the other hand, wouldn't get off so easily. Mark still had connections, friends from the military, who specialized in tracking people and uncovering secrets. And if Ryan thought this was over, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. Thanks for sticking with me so far. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And let us know in the comments what you think about Mark's situation so far. What would you do if you were in his shoes? Now, let's keep going, because things are about to heat up. Mark sat in his truck outside Ryan's office, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. The building's glass windows reflected the morning sun, but all Mark could see was the smug expression Ryan had worn the last time they'd spoken, at Mark and Emily's anniversary party, no less. Back then, Ryan had been all smiles, patting Mark on the back and calling him brother. Now, the word felt like poison. Mark exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He wasn't here to cause a scene, not yet. This was reconnaissance. Gather intel first, act later. That's what he'd been trained to do. He watched Ryan exit the building, laughing into his phone. The sight of him so carefree, so untouched by guilt, made Mark's blood boil. Ryan looked like a man who'd won, but Mark wasn't finished yet. Later that afternoon, Mark met with his lawyer, Ethan Greer, a no-nonsense guy with sharp eyes and a sharper suit. This isn't just about the divorce, Mark said, sliding over the folder he'd prepared. I want full custody of Sophie, and I want Ryan's life to burn. Ethan flipped through the documents, his brows raising slightly as he skimmed the emails and text messages Mark had compiled. You've got a case, Ethan said, nodding. But it won't be easy. Courts are hesitant to strip custody from a mother unless you can prove she's unfit. Mark leaned forward. She let Ryan act like Sophie's father while I was risking my life overseas. She lied, she cheated, and she dragged my daughter into it. Ethan held his gaze. We'll hit her where it hurts, but you need to be prepared. This is going to get messy. Mark didn't flinch. Messy is fine. Days turned into weeks, and the legal battle began. Emily fought hard, portraying herself as a struggling mother who'd made a mistake while trying to cope with Mark's absence. Mark, on the other hand, presented facts. He had documents proving Emily and Ryan's relationship started months before his deployment ended. He showed how Emily had tried to limit his contact with Sophie and even attempted to convince their daughter that Mark might not come home. But the real bombshell came when Ethan dug into Ryan's finances. Turns out, Ryan wasn't as squeaky clean as he liked to pretend. Fraudulent business deals, unpaid taxes, and a suspiciously high number of canceled contracts painted a very different picture. And Mark wasn't the only one who noticed. The court agreed to investigate Ryan's finances, putting Emily's credibility further into question. While the legal wheels turned, Mark had his own plans in motion. He hired a private investigator, a former Marine named Tyler, who specialized in digging up dirt, and Tyler delivered. Ryan had been living way above his means. Fancy dinners, luxury vacations, and expensive gifts for Emily, all funded by clients he'd scammed. Mark's fist tightened as he read the report. It wasn't just betrayal, it was arrogance. Ryan hadn't just stolen Mark's wife. He'd flaunted it. Now it was Mark's turn to take something back. Mark didn't expect to see Ryan at the gym. It was too perfect, almost scripted. Ryan was mid-bench press when Mark stepped in front of him, arms crossed. Ryan froze, lowering the weights awkwardly. "Mark," he said, his voice tight. "We should talk." Mark's eyes narrowed. "We're past talking." Ryan sat up, wiping sweat from his face. "Look, You don't get to explain," Mark interrupted. "Not after what you did to my family." Ryan stood, suddenly defensive. "I didn't force Emily to do anything. She came to me, Mark. She needed someone, and you weren't there." Mark took a step closer, his voice low and steady. "You think that justifies what you did?" Ryan faltered, but Mark wasn't finished. "You played house with my wife and daughter while I was risking my life, and now you're going to pay for it." Before Ryan could respond, Mark walked away. He didn't need to throw punches. The courts, the investigators, and the truth would do that for him. Emily's world began to crumble faster than she could hold it together. First, the school board caught wind of the affair, and parents began questioning her judgment. She was quietly placed on leave, and rumors started spreading. Then, the investigation into Ryan's finances made the news, and suddenly, Emily's name was tied to fraud and scandal. Mark's lawyer made sure the court saw every detail. Emily's character, once painted as the devoted mother, was now under scrutiny. Sophie's teachers even testified about changes in her behavior, how she'd seemed withdrawn and confused after Ryan started spending more time around the house. The judge wasn't impressed, and when Sophie herself spoke in court, saying she wanted to stay with her dad, it sealed the deal. Mark was awarded full custody. Emily got supervised visitation. And Ryan? He was facing criminal charges. But Mark wasn't satisfied yet. He wanted Ryan to feel the weight of everything he'd done. So, when the private investigator found evidence that Ryan had stolen money from his own company, Mark handed it over to the authorities. Ryan's assets were frozen. His business collapsed. And Emily. She was left picking up the pieces alone. Mark sat on the couch, watching Sophie build a castle out of Legos. "Daddy, look," he smiled. "That's amazing, Peanut." For the first time in months, Mark felt peace. But he knew this wasn't over. Not completely. Ryan and Emily would try to rebuild. They'd try to spin the story, to make themselves the victims. Mark wasn't going to let that happen. He'd fought wars before, and he wasn't afraid to fight another. Thanks for sticking with me so far. Don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this story. Let me know in the comments. What do you think Mark should do next? Should he move on or keep pushing for justice? Mark sat in his dimly lit living room, the glow of his laptop illuminating his face. On the screen was Ryan's mugshot, freshly uploaded to the local news site. Charges of fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion were plastered beneath his name. Mark's lips curled into a grim smile. The man who had destroyed his marriage and tried to steal his family was now a cautionary tale. But despite the win, Mark knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Emily had filed an appeal for joint custody, and her lawyer was pushing hard to paint Mark as unstable, a man scarred by war and unfit to raise a child alone. Mark clenched his fists. He'd fought for his country now. He'd fight for his daughter. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Emily sat across from Mark, her lawyer leaning in to whisper in her ear. She glanced up at Mark briefly, but her eyes darted away before their gazes could lock. Mark's lawyer, Ethan, leaned closer. "Stay calm. They're going to push hard, but we have the evidence. Stick to the facts." Mark nodded, his heart pounding. Emily's lawyer stood and began his attack. "Mr. Bennett, would you say your time in combat affected your ability to handle stress?" Mark's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I'd say it taught me how to face stress head-on." The lawyer smirked. "And yet, after discovering your wife's infidelity, you punched Mr. Ryan Carter in the face, didn't you?" Mark didn't flinch. I did. After finding him in my home with my wife, I believe most men would have reacted the same way. Emily's lawyer turned to the judge. Your Honor, this is a man who clearly has anger issues. Ethan shot up from his seat. Objection, character speculation without evidence. Sustained, the judge said, but the damage was done. Emily's lawyer smirked as he sat down. Mark's pulse quickened, but he kept his focus on Sophie. He wasn't fighting for revenge. He was fighting for her. The next witness was Sophie's teacher. She's doing better now, the woman said. Since living with her father, Sophie's grades have improved, and she seems more confident. She talks about how her dad helps her with schoolwork and encourages her. Emily's lawyer jumped up. But didn't Sophie also tell you she missed her mother? The teacher hesitated. Yes, but no further questions. Mark's lawyer stood. Did Sophie ever mention being uncomfortable with Mr. Carter? The teacher straightened. Yes. She said he tried to act like her dad, but she didn't like it. Mark's heart ached. He hated that Sophie had to deal with any of this. During the recess, Emily approached him. Mark, can we just talk? He turned slowly, his eyes hard. What's left to say? Tears welled up in her eyes. I messed up, okay? But I love Sophie. I never wanted to hurt her. Mark's voice dropped. Then why didn't you think about her before you let Ryan walk into her life like he owned it? Emily's lip trembled, but Mark didn't back down. This isn't about you or me anymore. It's about her, and I won't let you mess up her life again. She didn't argue. She just walked away, leaving Mark with the bitter taste of finality. The courtroom battle stretched late into the evening. Emily's lawyer pushed every angle, but Mark stayed steady, relying on evidence and facts. When the judge finally spoke, the room fell silent. After careful review, I find Mr. Bennett to be a fit and capable parent. Full custody will remain with him. Ms. Bennett will retain supervised visitation. Emily's face crumpled, but Mark barely noticed relief washed over him as Sophie ran to his side. Daddy, we won? He scooped her up. We won, Peanut. But the victory didn't erase the damage. Mark knew Emily wouldn't let this go. She'd keep trying to rebuild her image, spinning stories about Mark being unstable and dangerous, and Ryan. Even from behind bars, Mark doubted he'd stay quiet. Mark wasn't naive. He'd won this battle, but the war was far from over. That night, Mark tucked Sophie into bed and sat by her side until she fell asleep. He brushed her hair back, promising himself he'd protect her from anything that tried to tear their world apart. As he closed her door, his phone buzzed. It was Tyler, his private investigator. You're going to want to see this. Mark's heart skipped as he opened the email. Attached was a new photo of Ryan, meeting with a man Mark didn't recognize, except he wasn't supposed to be meeting anyone. Ryan's bail conditions restricted him from conducting business or contacting former associates. Mark's eyes narrowed. Whatever Ryan was planning, it wasn't over, and Mark wasn't about to let him win. Thanks for sticking with me through this roller coaster of a story. If you're enjoying it, don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments, what would you do if you were in Mark's shoes? Mark's eyes burned as he stared at the photo Tyler had sent him. Ryan, dressed in casual clothes, sat across from a man in a dark suit at a quiet corner table in a restaurant. The timestamp read 10:42 p.m. Well past the hours Ryan was legally allowed to leave his residence under his bail conditions. Mark's grip tightened around his phone. He wasn't surprised Ryan had always been arrogant, but this meeting shady contacts while under investigation. It was reckless, and Mark was about to use that recklessness against him. He hit call. Tyler, how sure are you about this meeting? Positive, Tyler replied. I tailed him there myself. And get this, the guy he met with Lucas Draper, high-profile defense attorney, who specializes in getting white-collar criminals out of tight spots. Mark's jaw tightened. So he's planning something? Definitely, Tyler said. I'll keep digging, but you should be ready for anything. Mark hung up and paced the living room, his thoughts racing. Ryan wasn't backing down, not even with his career, reputation, and freedom on the line. Fine. If Ryan wanted a fight, Mark was more than ready to finish it. The next morning, Mark dropped Sophie off at school. She gave him a hug before running toward her friends. and for a moment, Mark felt the weight lift. But as soon as he got back into the truck, reality hit. Emily's lawyer had filed another motion, this time claiming Mark was monitoring her activities and harassing her friends. The accusations were ridiculous, but the intent was clear. Emily wasn't trying to win custody anymore. She was trying to wear him down. Mark drove straight to Ethan's office. "They're playing dirty," Ethan said, flipping through the papers. Mark nodded. "Then let's hit back harder." Ethan smirked. "Already ahead of you. I submitted the financial records we found last week, proving Emily was funneling money from your joint account to cover Ryan's legal fees. The judge won't take kindly to that." Mark felt a surge of hope. It wasn't over yet. That night, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming. He sat in his home office, going through paperwork, when his phone buzzed again. It was Tyler. "You're not going to believe this," he said, his voice sharp. Mark straightened in his chair. "What now?" "Emily and Ryan. They're still talking. He called her last night, and I have the recording. They're trying to make you look unstable, planning to fabricate evidence that you threatened them." Mark's pulse pounded in his ears. "They're what?" "I'll send you the files," Tyler said. "But this isn't just talk. Ryan's pulling every string he has left." Mark gritted his teeth. Let him try. The next day, Mark faced Emily and her lawyer in court once again. But this time, he was ready. When Emily's lawyer accused him of harassment and intimidation, Ethan stood and calmly played the recording Tyler had uncovered. Emily's voice filled the courtroom. "If we make him look unstable, we'll get joint custody, maybe even full custody. If we push hard enough, Ryan's lawyer said it's our best shot." The courtroom fell silent. Emily's face drained of color as the judge turned to her. "Care to explain this?" her lawyer stammered, scrambling for an explanation. But it was too late. Mark locked eyes with Emily, and for the first time, he saw fear, real fear. When the session ended, Emily tried to approach him outside the courtroom. "Mark, please." He held up a hand, cutting her off. "Don't." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I didn't know what else to do." Mark's voice was cold. "You could have told the truth instead. You chose this." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, broken. But the real storm hit later that evening. Mark was getting Sophie ready for bed when his phone rang. It was Tyler. "You're not going to like this," he said. "Ryan skipped bail." Mark froze. "What?" "His lawyer claims he hasn't heard from him, but my contacts say Ryan cleaned out what little money he had left and disappeared." Mark's stomach sank. "What about Emily?" "She claims she doesn't know where he is, but I don't buy it." Mark looked down at Sophie, brushing her hair as she giggled at her reflection in the mirror. "Keep digging," he said quietly. Tyler didn't have to ask why. If Ryan had skipped town, it meant one thing. He wasn't finished, and Mark wasn't about to let him get anywhere near his daughter. Over the next few days, Mark barely slept. Tyler kept feeding him updates, sightings, rumors, and dead ends. Ryan was on the move, but no one knew exactly where he was heading. Then, late one night, Mark's phone buzzed again. A text. "You took everything from me. Now it's my turn." Mark's blood ran cold. It was from an untraceable number, but he knew who it was. Ryan. Mark immediately called the police, but without a clear threat, they couldn't do much. "Stay alert," the officer told him, "and keep your doors locked." But Mark wasn't just going to sit and wait. He reinforced the locks, installed cameras, and made sure every window was secure. Sophie didn't notice. But Mark was always on edge, checking shadows, watching cars, waiting for Ryan to make his move. And then it happened. It was late, past midnight, when Mark heard a noise outside. He grabbed his pistol and moved toward the window, his heart pounding. A shadow moved by the garage. Mark's training kicked in. He moved quickly but quietly, positioning himself by the back door. Then he saw him, Ryan, dressed in dark clothes, trying to pry open the lock. Mark threw the door open, leveling his gun. "Don't move." Ryan froze, but Mark could see the desperation in his eyes. "You ruined my life," Ryan hissed. Mark's voice was steady. "You did that yourself." Ryan lunged, but Mark was ready. He tackled him to the ground, pinning him with one arm while calling the police with the other. By the time the officers arrived, Ryan was cuffed and screaming. Mark didn't flinch as they dragged him away. It was over. Mark sat on the couch later that night, holding Sophie's stuffed rabbit in his hands. She was safe upstairs, and Ryan was gone for good. But Mark knew the scars would linger. He looked around the house, the one he'd fought so hard to protect, and felt something he hadn't in a long time. Peace. Thanks for sticking with me through this intense journey. Don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments, what did you think about Ryan's downfall? Did Mark handle it the right way? Mark stood in his kitchen, staring at the shattered back door. The frame was splintered where Ryan had tried to force his way in. The glass was cracked, tiny shards glinting under the dim light. Sophie was still asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware of how close danger had come, but Mark couldn't stop the image from replaying in his head. Ryan's face twisted with rage, lunging at him in the dark. The police had taken him away, but Mark knew better than to relax. People like Ryan didn't give up. They got desperate, and desperation made them dangerous. Mark grabbed his phone and dialed Tyler. "He's in custody," Mark said as soon as Tyler picked up. "But I need more eyes on Emily. If he was bold enough to show up here, I'm not convinced she didn't know." Tyler's voice was sharp. "I'll make some calls, but you need to lock that place down tighter than Fort Knox." "Already working on it." Mark hung up and took a deep breath. He wasn't scared. He'd faced worse in combat. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was his home. And now, it was a war zone. The next morning, Mark woke up to another text. "You think this is over? It's not." His stomach dropped. The number was blocked, but Mark knew the message had to be from someone connected to Ryan. Maybe a friend, maybe Emily. Mark immediately sent it to Tyler. Minutes later, his phone rang. "That wasn't Ryan," Tyler said. "The number was pinged near Emily's house." Mark's pulse quickened. "Emily? Looks like it, but there's more." Mark braced himself. "I traced some of Emily's calls over the last few weeks. She's been in contact with Ryan almost every day, even after the restraining order." Mark gritted his teeth. "She's working with him." Tyler hesitated. "Looks that way. I don't know what their endgame is, but they're not done." Mark closed his eyes and exhaled sharply. He wasn't sure how much more betrayal he could stomach. That afternoon, Mark met with his lawyer again. "They're trying to set you up," Ethan said. "Emily's latest motion claims you violated the restraining order, despite the fact that Ryan showed up at your house." Mark ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. "They're trying to flip the narrative." Ethan nodded. "They know they're losing, so they're throwing everything they've got at you, but we'll push back harder." Mark clenched his fists. "Do it. I want this over." The next few days were a blur. Mark tightened security around the house, adding motion sensors and cameras at every entry point. He barely slept, constantly on edge, waiting for the next attack. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was Sophie's school. "Mr. Bennett, we need you to come down here immediately." Mark's heart stopped. "What's wrong? Is Sophie okay?" "She's fine," the principal said. "But her mother tried to pick her up. She claimed it was her visitation day, but when we checked the schedule, it wasn't." Mark's blood boiled. "I'll be there in 10 minutes." When Mark arrived, Sophie was sitting in the principal's office, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Daddy!" She ran to him, and Mark scooped her up, holding her tight. "What happened, Peanut?" "She said she was taking me to see Uncle Ryan." Mark's stomach dropped. Emily had tried to take Sophie, and she was planning to bring her to Ryan. Mark turned to the principal. "Did you call the police?" "They're on their way." Mark nodded, his jaw tight. "They're not getting away with this." The police arrested Emily an hour later. She was hysterical, screaming about how Mark had stolen Sophie and ruined her life. Mark watched from a distance, his face hard. The Emily he'd fallen in love with was gone. What stood in her place was someone desperate, broken, and dangerous. And now, she'd face the consequences. Later that night, Mark sat with Sophie on the couch, watching cartoons to distract her from the day's chaos. "Daddy?" "Yeah? Peanut? Is Mommy going to jail?" Mark hesitated. "She might, but no matter what happens, I'll always be here to take care of you." Sophie nodded, leaning against him. "I don't want to see Uncle Ryan ever again." Mark kissed the top of her head. "You won't." The final court hearing was brutal. Emily's arrest and Ryan's repeated violations sealed their fate. The judge not only upheld Mark's full custody, but also terminated Emily's visitation rights indefinitely. Ryan was sentenced to prison for fraud, embezzlement, and violating his restraining order. And Emily? She was left with nothing. No custody, no money, and no support. As Mark left the courtroom, Sophie held his hand tightly. "Can we go get ice cream now?" Mark laughed, the weight finally lifting off his shoulders. "Absolutely, Peanut. Thanks for sticking around until the end of this wild ride. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Did Emily and Ryan get what they deserved? What would you have done differently?" Mark sat in his truck outside the police station, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The image of Emily being dragged away in handcuffs played on a loop in his mind. Her screams, her desperate pleas. It was like watching someone completely unravel. But Mark didn't feel relief. Not yet. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Not while Ryan was still out there, pulling strings from the shadows. His phone buzzed. "Tyler." Mark answered immediately. "Tell me you have something." "I do," Tyler said, his voice tense. "And you're not going to like it." Mark's stomach sank. "Ryan's been talking to someone on the inside. He's planning something big. I don't have all the details yet, but my sources are saying it involves Emily, and possibly Sophie." Mark's jaw tightened. "No, he's not getting near her again." "I'll keep digging," Tyler promised, "but you need to stay alert." Mark didn't need the reminder. He was already running through every worst-case scenario in his head. That night, Mark sat at the dining table, his gun resting within reach. He checked the security cameras again, scanning every angle for movement. Sophie was asleep upstairs, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her arms. She didn't know about the war raging around her. Mark wanted to keep it that way. But as the clock ticked past midnight, his phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Tyler. It was Emily. "You think you won. You haven't. Ryan's coming for you, and there's nothing you can do to stop him." Mark's blood ran cold. He read the message twice, his pulse pounding in his ears. Emily wasn't just desperate, she was dangerous. And now, she was working with Ryan. Mark drove straight to Tyler's office the next morning. "Tell me you have more," Mark said, slamming the door behind him. Tyler slid a folder across the desk. "Emily's been funneling money to one of Ryan's contacts, small payments, spread out to avoid suspicion. But it's all there. They're paying someone off, most likely to help Ryan skip town or set something up." Mark flipped through the documents, his stomach twisting with every page. "They're planning something," Mark said, his voice sharp, "and we need to stop it." Tyler nodded. "I've already tipped off the police, but we need more evidence if we're going to make it stick. I've got eyes on Emily's place, and my guys tracking Ryan's movements. We'll get them." Mark exhaled slowly, his fists clenching. "We'd better." Days passed, and Mark barely slept. He kept his routine for Sophie's sake: school drop-offs, bedtime stories, and weekend trips to the park. But every time he looked at her, he felt the weight of what was at stake. Then the call came. Tyler's voice was rushed. "Ryan's on the move. He's meeting Emily at a storage unit downtown." Mark grabbed his keys. "I'm on my way." The storage facility was dimly lit, rows of metal doors stretching endlessly down concrete corridors. Mark parked 2 blocks away and approached quietly, his heart pounding. He spotted Tyler near the entrance, dressed in black and leaning against a wall. "They're inside," Tyler whispered. "Unit 114. Mark nodded, pulling his gun from the holster. "Let's end this." They moved quickly but quietly, sticking to the shadows until they reached the unit. Voices echoed through the thin walls, Emily's panicked whispers and Ryan's sharp, angry tone. Mark motioned for Tyler to cover the back entrance before stepping closer to the door. Inside, Ryan's voice cut through the silence. "You promised you could fix this." Emily's reply was barely audible. "I didn't know Mark would fight this hard." Mark's chest tightened. He didn't wait. With one swift motion, he kicked the door open, his gun raised. "Don't move!" Ryan spun around, his eyes wide with panic. Emily froze, her hands trembling. "What the hell is this?" Mark demanded, his voice like steel. Ryan stepped forward, his hands raised. "Relax, Mark. Let's talk about this." Mark shook his head. "No more talking." Ryan lunged, but Mark was faster. He tackled Ryan to the ground, pinning him with one knee as Tyler stormed in from the back entrance. "Police are on the way," Tyler said, cuffing Ryan's wrists. Emily collapsed against the wall, sobbing. Mark didn't even look at her. Instead, he turned to Ryan. "This ends here." Ryan glared up at him, hatred burning in his eyes. "You think you've won?" Mark leaned closer. "I know I have." The police arrived minutes later, dragging Ryan and Emily away in handcuffs. Mark watched from a distance, his hands still trembling. Tyler clapped him on the shoulder. "You did it." Mark exhaled. "No, we did it." Later that night, Mark tucked Sophie into bed, brushing her hair back as she drifted off to sleep. For the first time in months, the house felt safe, but Mark knew the scars would take longer to heal. He sat on the edge of the bed, watching Sophie breathe softly. She was the reason he'd fought so hard, the reason he hadn't given up, and no matter what, he'd keep fighting for her. Thanks for sticking with me through this incredible journey. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments. Do you think Mark made the right decisions? What would you have done in his shoes? Mark sat in the dimly lit living room, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline rush of the night before. The house was quiet now. Too quiet. Sophie was fast asleep upstairs, completely unaware of how close danger had come, but Mark couldn't relax. Not yet. He stared at the police report on the table, the words blurring together. Ryan and Emily were both in custody, facing multiple charges, breaking and entering conspiracy violation of a restraining order. But Mark knew this wasn't over. Ryan had a way of slipping through cracks, of twisting situations to his advantage. And Emily. She was unpredictable, her desperation making her even more dangerous than before. Mark leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He'd come this far. He couldn't let his guard down now. The next morning, Mark met with Ethan at his office. "They're both locked up," Ethan said, flipping through the files. "But Ryan's lawyer is already pushing for bail. Claims Ryan's rights were violated when you restrained him." Mark's fists clenched. "You're kidding me." Ethan shook his head. "I wish I was. They're playing the victim card hard, but we've got enough evidence to keep them tied up in court for months." Mark exhaled, forcing himself to stay calm. Months. That gave him time to prepare. Back at home, Mark installed even more security, extra locks, reinforced doors, and cameras covering every corner of the property. He wasn't taking any chances. But it wasn't just about safety anymore, it was about control. For too long, Ryan and Emily had dictated the rules of this fight. Now it was Mark's turn to set the terms. 2 days later, Mark got the call he'd been dreading. "They're out," Tyler said. Mark froze. "What?" "Ryan posted bail this morning. Emily's lawyer got her released under supervision. They're both free, for now." Mark's pulse pounded in his ears. What's their next move? Emily's lawyer filed an emergency appeal for visitation rights. Mark's stomach twisted. "No, not after what they did." "They don't care," Tyler said. "They're throwing everything they have at you. But don't worry, I've already started tracking them. They won't get near Sophie." Mark's voice hardened. "They'd better not." That night, Mark couldn't sleep. He sat by Sophie's door, his gun resting in his lap, his thoughts racing. Ryan was out, Emily was out, and they were both coming for him. But Mark wasn't the same man he'd been when this started. He wasn't scared anymore. He was ready. The next day, Mark drove Sophie to school, keeping an eye on the rearview mirror the entire way. When he pulled into the parking lot, his worst fear came true. Emily was there. She stood near the entrance, her arms crossed and her eyes red from crying. Sophie spotted her immediately. "Mommy?" Mark's heart sank. "Stay in the car, Sophie." "But now." Mark stepped out, shutting the door behind him. "What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded. Emily raised her hands defensively. I just wanted to see her. You don't get to make that decision, Mark snapped. Not after what you pulled. She's my daughter, too. Emily's voice cracked. Mark took a step closer, lowering his voice. No, she stopped being your priority the moment you dragged her into your mess. Emily's face twisted with desperation. I just want to talk. Leave. The sharpness in Mark's voice made Emily flinch. Or I'll call the cops. For a moment, she looked like she might fight back, but then her shoulders slumped, and she turned away. Mark waited until she was out of sight before getting back in the car. Daddy? Sophie's voice was small. It's okay, Peanut, Mark said, forcing a smile. Let's get you to class. But inside, his stomach churned. Emily wasn't giving up, and that meant the fight was far from over. Later that evening, Tyler called again. Emily's been talking to Ryan, he said. She's desperate, and he's feeding off it. They're planning something. Mark's grip tightened around the phone. Do we know what? Not yet, Tyler admitted. But I'll find out. Mark hung up, his chest tight. He'd been hoping this was the end. But now? Now it felt like the real fight was just beginning. The next day, Mark got another text. You can't keep her from me forever. Mark's blood ran cold. He didn't recognize the number, but he didn't have to. It was Ryan. Mark sent the screenshot to Tyler. We need to shut this down. Fast. That night, Mark waited. He sat in the living room, gun in hand, eyes locked on the security monitors. Hours passed. Nothing. Then, movement. Mark froze, staring at the screen as a figure appeared near the back fence. Ryan. Mark moved quickly, slipping out the back door and circling around. He caught Ryan just as he was climbing over the fence. Don't move, Mark said, gun raised. Ryan froze. Put it down, Mark, he said, his voice shaking. Not this time. Ryan took a step back, his hands up. You won't shoot me. Mark's voice was ice. Try me. Ryan's confidence cracked. He stumbled, losing his footing and falling hard onto the ground. Seconds later, the police arrived, lights flashing and sirens blaring. Mark lowered his gun as the officers took over, cuffing Ryan and hauling him to his feet. Ryan's eyes locked on Mark's as they dragged him away. This isn't over. Mark didn't flinch. Yes, it is. Back inside, Mark checked on Sophie, brushing her hair back as she slept. He finally allowed himself to breathe. Ryan was gone. Emily was out of options, and for the first time in months, Mark felt hope. Thanks for sticking with me through this wild ride. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments, do you think Ryan's arrest is the end, or will there be another twist? Mark stood in the quiet of his living room, staring out the window as the early morning sunlight spilled across the floor. It had been 3 days since Ryan's arrest, 3 days since Mark finally felt like he could breathe again. The house felt different now, lighter. For the first time in months, the weight of fear and uncertainty wasn't hanging over him. Sophie's laughter echoed down the stairs, and Mark turned to see her running into the kitchen, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Daddy, can we make pancakes? Mark smiled, scooping her up and spinning her around. Pancakes it is. Sophie giggled, and Mark couldn't help but feel a rush of gratitude. After everything they'd been through, she was still smiling, still happy, and that was all that mattered. Later that afternoon, Mark sat in his lawyer's office one last time. Ethan handed him the final court papers, a satisfied grin on his face. It's official, Ethan said. Emily's visitation rights are terminated, and the restraining order against Ryan has been extended indefinitely. He's facing multiple felony charges, so he won't be seeing the outside of a prison cell for a long time. Mark exhaled, relief flooding through him. It's over. Ethan nodded. It's over. But Mark knew this wasn't just the end of a legal battle. It was the end of the person he used to be, the man who trusted too easily, who believed love was enough to protect him from betrayal. That man was gone. The man who remained? He was stronger, smarter, and ready to face whatever came next. Back at home, Mark unpacked boxes in Sophie's new room. She'd wanted a fresh start, so he let her pick out new decorations. Rainbows, stars, and pictures of princesses covered the walls. "Daddy, look!" Sophie pointed to a drawing she'd made, a picture of the two of them standing under a big, bright sun. Mark knelt beside her, taking the picture in his hands. "This is perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Sophie grinned and threw her arms around his neck. "You're the best daddy ever." Mark held her tightly, silently promising that he'd never let anything hurt her again. The next week, Mark met Tyler at a coffee shop to wrap up the investigation. "I have to say," Tyler began, stirring his coffee, "I've seen some messy cases, but this was personal." Mark nodded. But it's done now." Tyler leaned back, a smirk tugging at his lips. "You sure about that? I heard Emily's trying to claim she was manipulated by Ryan, playing the victim card again." Mark's jaw tightened, but he shook his head. "She can say whatever she wants, nobody's buying it this time." Tyler raised his mug in a mock toast. "To consequences." Mark clinked his glass against Tyler's. "To consequences." The days turned into weeks, and slowly, life began to settle. Mark enrolled Sophie in a new school, signed her up for ballet lessons, and even started attending parenting groups to make sure she felt supported. But the biggest change wasn't in Sophie. It was in Mark. The fear that had once gripped him was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. He wasn't just a survivor, he was a fighter. And no matter what came next, he knew he could handle it. One afternoon, Mark received a call from an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Hello? Mark." It was Emily. Mark's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you want?" There was a long pause before she spoke. I wanted to say I'm sorry." Mark's stomach twisted, but he stayed silent. "I know I can't fix what I did," Emily continued, her voice breaking. "But I'm trying to change for Sophie's sake." Mark closed his eyes, the anger he'd carried for so long bubbling to the surface. "You had your chance," he said finally, "and you threw it away." Emily sniffled. "I just hope someday you'll let me make it right." Mark didn't answer. He ended the call and set the phone down, his chest tight. Maybe she was telling the truth, but he couldn't risk letting her back in. Not after everything she'd done. Months later, Mark sat on the bleachers at Sophie's ballet recital, his heart swelling with pride as she twirled across the stage. She was happy. She was safe, and that's all he ever wanted. After the recital, Sophie ran to him, beaming. "Did you see me, Daddy?" Mark scooped her up and kissed her cheek. "You were amazing." As they walked to the car, Mark felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. For the first time, he wasn't looking over his shoulder. He wasn't waiting for the next attack. He was free. Thank you so much for sticking with me until the very end of this wild story. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed telling it. If you haven't already, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more intense and emotional stories like this one. And let me know in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Mark's shoes? I'll see you in the next video.